Hi, we're here today with Scott Raecker, who serves as the executive director of the Robert D. and Billy Ray Center at Drake University, a position he has held since the work of the center was founded by former Governor Robert D. Ray in 1997 as a lasting legacy to the 150th anniversary of the state's founding. The Ray Center has a mission to improve civility through character development and ethical leadership. And as the unprecedented events unfolded on January 6th in Washington, we found ourselves as an apolitical media organization that covers business and doesn't endorse candidates or cover elections, trying to wrestle a little bit with some of the implications and effects that the situation might be having on businesses. Because the reality is civic engagement, civility, and disruptions to democracy do affect our workplace and our places of business and our community. And I think I could think of nobody better than Scott to come on, ask a little bit about some best practices about how fundamentally we can bring civility into the workplace, into businesses. And so, Scott, I want to thank you for being here today. Emily Barsky, also our associate editor, she's going to kick things off with the first question for you. And thank you again for being here today.
Thank you.
So, Scott, yesterday we saw some national business and industry leaders quickly condemning the violence and the storming of the U.S. Capitol. And that's a little bit unprecedented because usually business leaders typically stay out of the political arena, at least publicly. And so I'm just wondering, what do you see as the role that businesses play in creating civility in our society?
Well, thanks for the question, Emily. And you are correct. It was unprecedented, and the response was unprecedented. We've never had this happen in our lifetimes of this type of engagement at our Capitol. And clearly, the good governance of our country and our individual states impacts our business communities all across this country. And if there is uncertainty, if there is disruption within good governance, it leads to tremendous uncertainty within the business arena. So I don't think it was unprecedented in the fact that they responded. This is critical in their ability to do business. And I think businesses have a responsibility to be focused and raising the awareness of these civility issues. In our work, one of the things we see is that people tend to gravitate immediately to the public arena and the political side on the civility context and discussion. Civility is more than just being mannerly and nice and etiquette. It's about how do we agree to disagree? How do we find common pathways forward, which business does a great job of, to be creative, to be innovative, to resolve and solve complex problems. Business could actually be looked to as a leader for some of the challenges we're seeing in the public space right now around civility and incivility.
And obviously, when employees are coming to work, it's not like they're not taking their beliefs with them. Everyone brings their own personal identities and beliefs with them when they come to work. So how can we make sure that the conversations that people have about their beliefs at work, that we can keep them civil and keep them focused on discussion and not necessarily this polarization that we're seeing?
Well, clearly we are a polarized society, and it's more than just the politics. There's polarization around all types of issues. But I believe in the workplace, it's like general society. We need to focus on some common elements that we know and are probably already doing in many regards, and with intentionality, continue to do those. We hear a lot of discussion recently in the most recent years about workplace culture. Workplace culture is driven by core competencies of character and ethical leadership that lead to a heightened level of civility, and what work is being done in any individual business to raise and elevate that culture. Now, an aside to this is it has become more difficult in this last year with the heightened elements and anxiety and angst of the global pandemic. And so that needs to be taken into consideration. But I'd encourage business leaders to think about what are they doing with their own workplaces. We use the acronym TEAM: teach, encourage, advocate, and model. What are we teaching that we want to see in our workplaces around these concepts of people that have differing opinions, but we still need to get the report done together or the project done together? What are we doing to encourage that? Even encouraging the time and space to build relationships within the organizational structure, which is the foundation of civility and leadership. How do we become advocates in the workplace and this is what you saw yesterday, is not just advocates within the organization, they became advocates within the community at large, within the country at large, advocates that this is the way we want to see business done in our community. And I would say, you talk to Jay Byers at the partnership, talk to business leaders across this community. We've got several initiatives regionally that are going on right now that would not be happening if we did not have a high level of civility in this area. I actually think the Des Moines region, Central Iowa, can be the home address for best practices in civility. And that's really an element of what the Ray Center has been working on for many years. And the last element of team is modeling and asking and encouraging our leaders to model. And I'll give you one quick one, the ability to model relationship building, right? This is foundationally rooted in our ability to build relationships and seek to understand and be understood with those that are new and different for us. So whether it be at the type of events that you host, whether it be the Book of Lists or your breakfast series, or whether it be in the individual workplace, where through team meetings, you can have the opportunity to build relationships and learn about people beyond just what their position on one particular issue may be. And I know that's a lot to think about, but if you distill it down to some simple actions of being intentional about building relationships and seeking to understand people and where they're coming from and to be understood, and doing that, having the courage and the conviction to do that with people that are new and different to you.
Scott, I want to touch on something that you've talked about a little bit, which is we're all going to go into our workplace. We're going to have business meetings that we're trying to do. As a business, how do you react in that moment when you've got that meeting while something is happening that is so politically charged, and people are coming into that situation with their own beliefs, their own set of systems, and I'm curious what your approach would be in a type of situation like that.
So we have a very tight-knit, high culture organization here with 10 members on our team. We meet weekly, and if today or even yesterday had been one of our team meetings, we would have absolutely addressed this. Yesterday's situations, I actually believe, and time will tell as this bears out, but having lived through explosion of a space shuttle, having lived through 9/11, there are certain days within our lifespan that are those epic days. I was just a very young child when President Kennedy was assassinated, when those types of elements that come to play in our lives, and you remember those as a kind of historic moments. Yesterday was a day like that. I think history will bear that out. But for many people, it was that stop and pause. Never in my lifetime did I think I would see this happening. And you have to be able to acknowledge that with your team members in your workplace. You have to acknowledge, and for us specifically, right, we're an organization predicated on a vision to transform lives and strengthen communities, to fulfill a mission to improve civility through character development and ethical leadership. What happened yesterday is in the core sweet spot of why we try to serve 8 million youth with character counts around the globe, because we have to raise up the next generation of how do we demonstrate great civility through character and ethical leadership. So I think I would encourage business leaders to not just gloss over this, and I don't think anybody is right now. But let's be attentive to this. Let's be intentional. Let's say this is a historic moment in the life of our country. Let's recognize and appreciate the blessings of our own community and the civility that we have and the good governance that we have and the positive things happening here. And at the same time, be in tune that we're also a community that's wrestling with other issues, whether that be social equity, racial justice issues that we are also trying to become better in. And we as leaders in our workplace need to model this. So I think the intentionality of addressing this with your team, of acknowledging this is a historic moment in our history. And I know there are probably some raw feelings this morning amongst our team about what happened. I know I didn't sleep well last night. What I know about our team, and I think most people that I'm familiar with, even those that really disagree with me on things, is these are people that love our country. They love our state. They love our community. They want to see things going better. And it's disruptive to our lives when things are so askew. And that angst and anxiety, again, fueled by other fatigue of COVID, comes into play. And then people aren't sleeping well, and they're kind of raw with their emotions on this. We have to acknowledge that, no different than any other historic moment in our nation's span.
And I think you said something, you can't, if you run from the moment, right? If we pretend that it's not happening, that's putting a barrier in front of having civility, right? And so I'm curious, in that moment, again, there's going to be this feeling of it's going to be uncomfortable, and so I'm curious how you navigate those uncomfortable situations.
Well, and again, I'm going to come back to something I'd said before, and that is it's based on relationships. So we spend intentional time in our organization and our team to build culture, to be candid in our conversations. We have a touchstone on how we're going to operate and work together using the 6 pillars, as well as how we want to seek optimal performance. So it wouldn't be a one-off in our organization to have that kind of conversation. But I do think it comes from the intentionality of saying, hey, before we jump into this today, I want to at least acknowledge that our world changed in a bit regard. I'm not even sure yet how it's changed, but I want to at least acknowledge that that's changed. I'm not expecting that we have a 30-minute conversation on this, but I'm not going to go into business today. Probably every conversation, and I have a day of back-to-back meetings on Zoom, and I would bet in every call I will bring up this element of acknowledging this. And the way I think about it, Chris and Emily, is leaning into this, right? Are we going to lean into this and say, what can we do to be better about this? And while I can't change the actions of what happened in Washington yesterday, I can change what I do today. I can reflect on how I lead today. I can reflect on what I model today, what I advocate for today. And so within our team, it would not be, I think, unusual that we would have that. And maybe even down the road in one of our openings, we'll have some video piece from YouTube or something, maybe a business record piece that we're going to listen to, and we're going to discuss that and say, how did that impact you, or how did you feel about that? And that's the intentional time, building relationship and allowing that space for people to share that experience. And I also think with business leaders, myself included today, it's like, I'm going to be in work contact with a lot of different people. Not everybody may be on their best game today. They may be so shaken to their core by the activities. We had some of this happen last summer here, of the angst, that we have to be human about this too. Uh, you know, the element of grace and caring and love are all things. When I listen to the 90 ideas in 90 minutes, and I listened to those speakers over the last several years, how many of them have talked about grace, compassion, care, love as the fuel that's necessary in the business environment? So these are things I think you're already seeing advocated for through what you're offering. And I really encourage you both to continue to strive to do this, that civility is part of the fabric of what we're doing within business. It's not an aside. It's not an additional thing to put on the plate. It really is the plate itself.
So, Scott, we know from some of the social movements that we've seen in the past few years with the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter and some of the other movements by underrepresented folks that there have been a lot of voices in the past that just haven't been at the tables with a lot of conversations within our community, within within the state and around the country. So I'm just wondering, within this context of civility, how do we make sure that all of the voices that need to be heard are part of conversations?
It's a really great question, Emily. And I think, as I look to our community right now, the greater Des Moines area, uh, I think we need to be intentional about this. And I'm really proud about where we're going with this. And while clearly we need to get better and can continue to get better, I'll give you a recent example. You just recently had an article about the Central Iowa Water Trails and the advancement of that really generationally changing movement that's taking place and advancing here in our community, which also in the formation of their multiple committees has an inclusion committee. And as they focused on the standards of how they were going to operate, not only maintenance standards, they focused on a toolkit for inclusion. Everything from what do restrooms look like along the water trails to meet the needs of diverse communities, but how do we get into communities that may not have naturally been attracted or drawn into water activities to make them comfortable with that? My point is, it's that level of intentionality. It's making sure that people have seats at the table. It would be, we've talked before, previously when you did the series as part of the breakfast series on civility. If that were to happen again, we would want to make sure that at the panelists at the table, and you would do this because this is who you are as a business community now, you're going to have people like Isaiah Knox there that's representing people that are struggling in many ways, that's offering his voice as a great leader in our community. And he is just one of many that are bringing that voice to the table. But it's It's the welcoming of those voices. It's the encouragement. It's the advocacy of those voices. And it's really not just having people at the table that might not have been there before. Let's remember some of our core communication skills as well. Let's seek to understand and then be understood. Let's really understand what their perspective is from marginalized voices in the past and how we can build on that as an asset to our community, rather than how do we just make sure they're in, part of it. And there's a big focus that we are seeing in our community right now, and I'm encouraged by that we have this action orientation around equity and inclusion. I think Drake University is doing a great job of that in and of itself as part of their core values as we work forward. We work all in this together, and a generosity of spirit, assuming the best intentions of people as we have interactions with them. So I think businesses putting their core values in action really helps us bring this diversity and inclusion into the forefront rather than just nice words that we hear from each other. So I'd encourage to see the business record continue to advocate for that as a strength of our community.
Emily, I want to give you a chance to ask a final question. I have one last one I'd like to ask Scott, but anything else that you have at the moment?
Well, one other thing that I think is maybe important to address here is that there's something at play because of the internet and the digital age we live in that we haven't seen before, with misinformation. And so a lot of people, one of the consequences that we saw at the events at the Capitol is that some people are taking misinformation as fact. So how does that play a role here in civility when at times, there's facts are out of what the conversation.
Yeah, there's a big difference between opinions and facts, and we all have the ability to have our own opinion. And just because we have an opinion doesn't mean it's factual or that it's the right opinion. I think this is another place where you has historically played a great role and continue to play a great role. And while they're not in the political space, but in the business space, it's still about facts that are out there that are shaping things within our community. So I think it's incumbent upon people now to really, we have to be a society that teaches ourselves and our next generation the ability to discern out factual information from inaccurate or non-factual information. In prior times, that may have been more responsibility within the journalistic society, but with the the advent of social media, with the advent of blogs from all over, how do you differentiate from a news organization such as yourself that vets out facts and somebody that's sitting in their basement writing a blog about what their opinions are and how that gets posted on a social media and then restated and restated and restated. So I think there's a whole element around this that would also be a really good series to focus on, is how the impact of social media and this vast 24/7 cycle of information, how do we fact check ourselves with a very high-paced and fast-paced society to know what is true and what is not true, what is opinion and what is fact. But I also think that the civility elements of social media come into play in large part here as well. And I saw some of this last night. And in fact, I'm sure I'm going to have some question about myself. I haven't posted anything on Facebook about what happened yesterday because that's not how I use Facebook. I don't use Facebook to be where I take political stands. I don't use that in my social media, to be making statements. And people have asked me, well, how come you haven't addressed this yet? And we may. I haven't decided yet. And this on my personal Facebook page. The reality is that I saw some feeds last night of people that they were out of hand on both sides. And it would have been so much better if they just pick up the phone and talk to each other, because you're very rarely going to change somebody's mind or opinion about whether something's fact or not by writing back one more Facebook post or one more tweet back and forth. So I think there's also a level, I've been thinking about this, of education for all of us around how do we use social media. And I think we've had a challenge of how it's been used at many levels, both in business and government, of how we communicate with that. So I think there's something here, Emily, that's probably deeper than just this answer I've given you. But I think we need to be cautious about how we use that space and cautious about how we use what's in that space to drive our actions.
Scott, I want to end and send us out on a positive note, and I know we're going to be able to do that because you're optimistic about this. And when we've talked before, you put this current situation into some perspective, and talked a little bit about why you're optimistic about our region specifically and our business community, and maybe why we have some things to be optimistic about as we're coming out of a day that, as you said, is a tough one for everybody to go through.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking the question, Chris, because I am optimistic. I've got a tremendously high positive attitude about where we're going, not only in this community, but I'm hopeful also for our country. And the reason I say that is there's been some context on the national level of it's never been worse than it is today. And it's bad today, and we need to get better. That's the real question. Can we be better than we are today? And the answer to that is yes, we can. And the question each of us need to be asking is, what can I do to help advance that? And the reason I say that is because, we live in a country, with just one example, where we lived in a country that at one time had a sitting vice president challenge a former cabinet member and political rival to a duel and shot and killed him. Hamilton being killed by Burr, whose political future was over, and obviously Hamilton lost his life. And I have to believe there were people like Chris, like Emily, like Scott saying, what can we do in our country to be better than this? We should not be having this as a way to resolve a political dispute. And we as a country evolved from that. And as bad as it is today, we're not having a political duel this morning on the shores of New Jersey, right? So I'm optimistic because there are people like us all across this country that are moved to say, what can I do to help us become better? And then I'll bring this back to our own community. I think we are actually probably a great example nationally, and if not internationally, on what best practices of civil dialogue, civil discourse, and civil practice would be. I'll give you two working examples that I have at least some familiarity with and that you've been writing about for some time. And one is the issues around the DART, Des Moines Area Regional Transit. They've gone through a new governance structure. They're working on a funding formula. They're bringing jurisdictions together that are working together through differences, through differing opinions, to come to a pathway for the greater good of what does regional transit look like for our metro area. It's been a textbook case of civility in action, fueled by the business community engaging local governance. And the other one that's going on right now, and I've mentioned it earlier, is the Central Iowa Water Trails. Multiple jurisdictions, municipal and county government levels, multiple business entities, being chaired by Dan Houston and co-chaired by Catherine Cooner, over 10 working committees, including an inclusion committee, over 100 volunteers, working through a generational type opportunity of our community. And it's being done how and why? Because they're coming to the table, despite their difference opinion, to see a greater good, a bigger goal, and working better together, not a cliche, truly working better together for a cause greater than themselves. And if we can do that right here in Central Iowa, there's no reason we can't do that as a country and as a globe. And for my own advocacy, I would tell you, that's why we're here. That's why the Robert D. and Billy Ray Center is here, to promote and advocate and bring to life the vision of Governor Ray to transform lives and strengthen communities by improving civility through character development and ethical leadership. So our role can be part of this too, from the educational element of the youngest children like yours, Chris, and parenting of how do I parent up a child to be able to discern these types of opportunities through good character and leadership, to strengthening that leadership in our businesses right now and our community, and being a beacon, if you will, a beacon of civility for our own state and our country coming right out of Central Iowa here. That's why I'm optimistic, because that's not a vision for the future. Those are things that are happening right now. And I don't even have time to tell you with excitement and time all the things that we're doing, but they include, serving over 8 million youth globally with the Character Counts framework, and working with state legislative leaders from all 50 states, all U.S. territories, Mexico, and Canada in the last 2 years on how they can work better together with more civility. And they're turning right here to the Ray Center and Central Iowa to find those answers. And that's why I'm proud to be a part of this community. And I'm really proud to have your presence in this community, both of you personally, but the business record as a beacon of best practices as well. That's why I'm optimistic, Chris.
Well, Scott, I appreciate you taking the time with us this morning. I think one of the things that I'm reflecting on after listening to you talk is, if I look back on some of those things that you mentioned and some of the challenges maybe that have erupted in the community at times, it's when those connections have been formed before the situation happens that it makes it a lot easier to navigate through whatever the situation is that comes up. And so I think that's really hard. Obviously, you have to be investing before you know something's ever going to happen. And I think the work that you guys are doing to give people that framework is really, really important. And I appreciate you taking the time to help put it in some context for us as a business organization that's trying to help other businesses do this as well. Again, Scott Raecker, he's the executive director of the Robert D. Billy Ray Center at Drake University. You can learn more at drake.edu/Ray Center. And I'd encourage you to check out their resources so that you can help bring some civility into your workplace as well. Thanks again, Scott.
Thank you.